Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the library for this conversation between Nicolas Niarchos and Pierre Haski about Nick's new book, The Elements of Power. First of all, how many of you have never been to the library before? Well, welcome. We're delighted to have you. We are an independent nonprofit organization. We are the largest English language lending library on the European continent. We are a home for the thoughtful and curious, and we're glad to have you here this evening. We are going to talk about the hidden human cost of the green energy transition. What does it really take to power a green future? I am going to introduce our speakers. They'll be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from you in the audience. I also want to single out our new director, Christina Verfoli, who is here this evening. She began in her role on April 1st, so a special welcome to Christina and to our speakers this evening. Nicolas Niarchos is a journalist whose work focuses on energy, war, and migration. He is the editor and co-founder of Now Voyager, a new magazine of international affairs. He has been a contributing writer at The New Yorker since 2014, where he initially started as a fact-checker. His reporting has also appeared in The Nation, The New York Times, and The Guardian. In 2023, he won an Edward R. Murrow Award for a radio report from Ukraine, produced with The New Yorker and WNYC, and his work on mining in Indonesia was shortlisted for a 2024 Livingston Award. He has testified before Congress on the effects of Congolese battery metal mining, which is the subject of his debut book, The Elements of Power. So, big round of applause for Nick. And joining him in conversation this evening is Pierre Haski, who has worked as a journalist for more than 5 decades. First at Agence France-Presse. Pierre, you got to take it out of your bio. And later at the French daily Libération. He was a foreign correspondent posted in Johannesburg, Jerusalem, and Beijing. In 2007, he co-founded the news website rue89.com. He has a daily geopolitics column on France Inter, France's #1 radio program. And since 2017, he's been president of Reporters Sans Frontières, a Paris-based international NGO. In 2026, this year, he launched a new YouTube channel on world affairs titled Le Monde de Pierre Haski, and his latest book, La Fin d'un Monde, was published just now by Stock. So a big round of applause for Pierre. Thanks. Take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening, everyone. In the previous century, Nicolas would have written a book about oil. This was the subject for all the issues that he's raising in his book. You know, environment, geopolitics, human interests and contradictions, and so on. Strangely enough, oil is still in the middle of many wars nowadays, and there's even a president who wants to drill a lot. So oil is still an important element of international life. But obviously, the world has moved on, and Nicolas is talking about today and mostly tomorrow's world. And that world is full of contradictions, and he's pointing to a deep one, which is that to produce the clean tech of today and tomorrow, we use what he called the dirtiest supply chain on earth. And that's what we're going to talk about. And my first question is what was your motivation? Was it an ethical motivation, the fact that we have this contradiction between dirty start for a clean end, and the fact that we are mostly using the minerals from the south extracted in those quite shameful conditions in many aspects to produce what looks like being the clean and modern world that we live in.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here tonight. Look, I think that the motivation originally came from having a phone, basically. I mean, you look at this piece of technology in your hand, and you can't open up the back these days. You don't know really what's inside. You're told lithium-ion battery. There was that point in 2014 or something, lithium-ion batteries started exploding on planes, or I think it was the Galaxy S7 Samsung, and nobody really understood what this technology was. And I started looking into it, and I started understanding that the way that people were proposing to get around in electric vehicles and drones and so on and so forth really was powered by lithium-ion batteries. So this battery made, in many ways, the 21st century that we know today a possibility. And that's a 21st century in which everybody is sort of wandering around looking at their phones and has pains in their neck as well. But it's also a 21st century in which Iran can manipulate power in the Strait of Hormuz by using very cheap drones to attack the shipping fleet. So I would argue that this was kind of the key question was a sort of inquisitive one. And then the secondary question was sort of where do these batteries come from? And one story that I got really interested in was a story of corruption. And I was finishing my job as a fact checker, and I was looking for stories. And somebody in the mining industry that I know said to me, look, you should really investigate this story of Dan Gertler. And he's a mining fixer who works in the Southern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Dan Gertler has, by some estimates, taken more than $1.5 billion from the Congo, and has been a major sort of profiteer in this industry. So I went down there. I said, okay, Gertler's quite interesting, but actually, what is this? I mean, you see these people digging out minerals by hand, and it wasn't even that hidden at that point. You see children lugging around these sacks of minerals. And is this the place that our cell phones come from? Is this the place that the green future is based on? And then I came back and I looked and I was like, look, maybe this isn't true. Maybe this is, maybe this is like some cobalt is from there. But I found out it was the majority of cobalt, which is this mineral that goes into your lithium-ion batteries. It's a mineral that keeps the cathode stable. It's a mineral that basically allows you to pack a huge amount of power into the batteries. And so that was really the motivation, the technology, the sort of inquiry around the technology, and then the sort of urge to show corruption in this industry.
The reason I asked about the ethical aspect is that your book is built on several parallel paths. One is a human path where you go and tell the stories of those diggers in the eastern DRC who have had their lives destroyed, have lost friends and relatives. And on the other side, you work on the industrial side, you work on the technological side, on the financial side, and so you have a very comprehensive view. But the human side, I found, was very interesting, because you could have written a book about the technology, the financial dimensions, and that would have made a pretty interesting book. But you insisted on digging those human stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of comes from the tradition of journalism that I've sort of grown up in, and that's a tradition in which, you try and tell the stories of ordinary people as well as these like big boardroom dramas. And in many ways, what I found was most important and most interesting was the lives of these diggers, these creusseurs, as they're called in French. And these people are really, at the center of the story for me, even though there are all these sort of geopolitical power games, and there are these kind of companies that are selling these mines for billions of dollars. But when you get to the mines, and what you see oftentimes is these people who have next to nothing digging out these minerals, which are then processed into the things that go into your phone. So I think that the real basis is these people at the bottom of the supply chain. And that I found really interesting. I sort of tried to understand their lives, and I thought that was a sort of useful thing that one could do, and that hadn't really been done very much in long form writing.
How do you explain that we are blind to that dimension? Because if you go on YouTube and you type cobalt mine DRC, you'll have videos of those kids who go deep into the ground, and they are like 10 because they are small and they can sneak in, and their life expectancy is probably 20. I mean, there's no way they can live longer. They don't go to school. They don't have medical support or anything, and we know that it's available online, and nobody cares.
Yeah, the book was a sort of effort to try and make people care about that, but also bring it into the broader picture, to show how this is not disconnected from these big deals that the companies were doing. This is not disconnected from the politics of Central Africa, which are now actually taking main stage in Washington. I mean, there's a huge amount of money going back and forth between these lobbying groups, between these people who are cozying up to Trump, cozying up to, there are different factions around Rwanda and around Congo and so on, and it's not disconnected from the larger and very important geopolitical reality that we live in, which is this contest between the US and China, which is so important in Africa, and shapes the lives of Africans from the presidents of their countries to the very poorest in society.
This is one of the interesting aspects, obviously, of the whole story, is the geopolitical background. How do you explain that for almost 20 years the US was not really active in that, not only in the technology itself? It was invented in the West and developed and made on an industrial scale in China, and on the access to minerals. It's only recently that the US has woken up to that reality, but China had already established its empire in that. How do you explain that incapacity to see what was happening?
I think this comes back to your earlier question about, you can go onto YouTube and see these child miners and stuff like that. The incapacity to see is because we live in a globalized world. We live in a world that was designed, in the sort of late and post-Soviet order, and it's a world that allows us to have very cheap technology, allows things to be produced very, very low cost in China, in different parts of the world, and it has led to deindustrialization in other countries in Europe and in the US and so on. So what globalization does as well is it insulates companies in the US. So say you're a large producer of cell phones, or you're a large producer of computers, or whatever it is, and you decide to make your phones in China. Until very recently, very few people were looking through that. Very few people were interested in where it was actually being made. It would just say, you would have a label that says made in China. So it kind of gave you a bit of a buffer. And then and then Apple, Foxconn, they had a lot of critiques around that.
Subcontractor Foxconn is a Taiwanese company that builds all the Apple equipment in China.
Exactly, and Foxconn, but then you have to look a stage beyond Foxconn, which is who's processing these minerals, who's importing these minerals, who's mining these minerals, and that is very, very difficult. And this was one of the ideas of the book, which was to just have enough time to go through the direct supply chain. And right at the beginning of the book, I had kind of wanted to track a shipment of cobalt as it came from Kolwezi, which is the city in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where a lot of these minerals are mined, all the way through the ports in Durban in South Africa, to the refining places in China, and then on to the US, in which it ended up in somebody's phone. This was impossible. We realized the logistics and just, this global supply chain was incredibly complicated to pass. And in fact, the shipping parts and the trucking parts, I mean, we were briefly talking about somebody who owned a very important trucking company in France, also who is known for his work with a publishing company, Bolloré, and his trucks are the ones that are coming out of, or the company that he started, that those trucks are coming out of these mines, and oftentimes you don't really know where they're going. It's kind of fascinating, this sort of this implication of so many different actors from around the supply chain, and it has such an impact on what we see as local or national politics in Europe, in the US, all over the world, and the fact that the point that I make at the beginning of the book, in the US, I mean, Elon Musk, much of his wealth, or much of his stratospheric wealth, because he was already very, very wealthy before he invested in Tesla, but is based on lithium-ion batteries. One of the sources of power that powers that wealth is the lithium-ion battery. So it's really interesting to see these people, who are these kind of battery kings, I guess, having such an effect on politics in places that are so far from the DRC.
But the country that has had the most coherent strategy is obviously China. I was based in China in the early 2000s, and I remember that BYD, which is now almost a household name, it's the name of a company that makes electric cars, but originally it was making only batteries. It's only recently that they started making cars. And the first big investor in BYD was Warren Buffett. And so the rise of these companies is part of the globalization of the 20th century, but they've had a state strategy which was very, very comprehensive and very clear.
Yeah. I mean, you could say that the first big investor outside of China was Warren Buffett, but the most important investor, we can't forget, always is the Chinese state. Yeah. And what I show in the book, there's a certain deal at a mine called Tenke Fungurume, which is one of the world's biggest copper cobalt mines in the southern DRC, just outside of the town of Kolwezi, the town that we were just speaking about. That part of that mine was sold using this kind of strange American hedge fund, which, surprise, surprise, Hunter Biden was somehow involved in, which was completely shocking to me, actually, when I found that out. And I spoke to somebody who was involved in that deal, and he takes me through it in one of the chapters in the book. And he was saying, look, the Bank of China even went around its own regulations because it was getting so much pressure to fund this deal. They weren't supposed to be exposed beyond a certain amount to this company, and so they had to give this loan through this strange hedge fund that existed in Hong Kong. Maybe it also insulated them politically as well to have Hunter Biden on the board. But anyway.
But have you found the roots? How did China made this gamble on electric vehicles and batteries? Because when it's, in the early 2000s, it was not obvious that lithium-ion batteries would be the object of the 20th century. I mean, no one was gambling on electric vehicles at that time.
Yeah, I think China, it's quite interesting because there's this idea that Chairman Mao said that every Chinese citizen will ride an electric bicycle one day. And in many ways...
I didn't know this quote.
And in many ways, China China has this very sort of directed approach to when it wants to do something, it will do it, and it sets industrial policy very well, also in some cases very wastefully. But they, in the in the 2000s up to the 2010s were really the pioneers in innovating around electric bicycles. So that was the kind of almost test case. But it's also to do with just very, very long-term strategy, and also something that I'm sure you noticed when you were in Beijing is just the incredible pollution in China. And they needed a way of cutting that down. An electric vehicle is a way of displacing that pollution from the exhaust pipe to mining, because we are told that we're told that these vehicles are clean and so on. There is still an environmental cost that comes with them. There is still environmental destruction that comes with nickel mining, with cobalt mining, with phosphate mining, and so on.
In this geopolitical context, do you think the US still has the capacity to catch up?
It's interesting because I was in Washington the other day and I had some meetings with some people at various different government departments who work on this. And they said they've sort of changed their tune. During the Biden administration, their whole thing was about creating a separate ecosystem that can rival China. And in many ways, that's what, if you follow these things, which probably most people don't, there was a critical minerals ministerial in February, at which Vice President Vance said, we're going to get into critical minerals with our allies, countries like Korea, countries like Canada, although there's a question about whether Canada's an ally now or not. And they said, look, this is the way that we're going to beat China, is that we're going to do what China's been doing as well, set prices for these minerals. So these are called price floors. And I thought, well, that's going to be really weird. There are going to be these two different critical minerals ecosystems. You know, everything from the rare earths that are used in magnets, to the minerals that are used in batteries, to these metals that are used in the fins of there's a big problem now with rare earths because Tomahawk missiles that they've been bombing Iran with actually have a lot of rare earths in them. And the US is now sort of burning through that stockpile, which is very, very interesting. But so the idea was that there were going to be two different ecosystems. And then when I spoke to people in Washington a couple of months ago, I said, well, yeah, that would be great if we got there. But, we just want to have our corner. We're not trying to beat the Chinese. We're not trying to, which in many ways that's a humble and intelligent strategy to some extent. But it is also an admission of just how effective China has been at sealing up this supply chain, at getting the mining tied up, and most crucially, getting the processing tied up, which is something I wasn't able to investigate in this book because I wasn't allowed to visit China for a second time.
Yeah, but that's where China's strength lies, because China doesn't produce cobalt or lithium. It imports the raw material and processes it, and that's where they've created these strongholds, like on the rare earths. Trump realized that China had the advantage when he imposed tariffs on China, and they retaliated by putting an embargo on rare earths, and he backed down. That's something that the US cannot tolerate too long. It's creating a dependency which is impossible to support.
Yeah, I think there's a nice quote from the Assistant Secretary of Defense, or of War, as Pete Hegseth would have you say, which is that critical metals aren't just this abstraction. They are the weapons, they are the technology, there are all these things that are so central to the US and to the way that the country runs itself. So I do think that this is a real point of tension, and unfortunately, I think that people are going to be fighting over these minerals. And unfortunately, this comes back to these questions in Congo, and you see what's happening with Rwanda in the east. You see these wars that are being fought, and you see all this money that's being poured into Washington. I mean, that's really also just as important as the battles that are being fought over Uvira and Goma and Rubaya mine and whatever it is. The financial clash in Washington is really fascinating to watch, but we certainly haven't seen the end of these types of conflicts. However, there's one thing that has to be said is that, you know, Africa looks at Europe and at the US to some extent as very much the colonized, or they have a history of colonization. And the Soviet Union had this as well during the Cold War in Russia. They were sort of free from that history of colonization to a large extent. Africans did not look at them and say, look, these are people who came to our country 50 years ago and took everything. And then they said, and I think that this has sort of come, this sort of halo effect, or whatever you want to call it, has sort of rested on the Chinese. And the Chinese have been very, very good about not actually, in recent history, not actually backing actors in conflicts. The Russians, that is not the case, of course. So people do see the, bless you, people do see people do see the Chinese as purely commercial actors in Africa. Of course, there is a geopolitical game there. There's a geostrategic game going on there. But actually, what they've done is that they've invested, not necessarily perfectly, actually in many cases in ways that are reminiscent of some aspects of colonialism, you could argue. But the Chinese have been very, very intelligent about doing it. And I think they've also come in with a certain mindset that was set out in the 60s, which was, at least for some of them, for some people, for some Chinese people, that we want to actually come here and improve things. So I wouldn't discount that either.
The Congo is obviously the country. I mean, you've been to Latin America or to Asia, but the Congo is really the heart, not of darkness, but the heart of the book, and you put it in a long perspective, historical. You talk about King Leopold of Belgium, who was the personal owner of the territory for more than 20 years before giving it to the Kingdom of Belgium. You were arrested in Congo for several days. Why did you invest so much time and energy in understanding the global issue of Congo?
And also, I just have to say, when I was arrested, RSF was sort of went out and campaigned for my release. So thank you. Look, the thing about Congo is that for whatever reason, I mean, I go into the geology and so on, but essentially it's a territory in which there are almost all of the minerals that are needed in this transition, and there is no other place in which cobalt, for example, is so concentrated. Congo sits on top of 3.4 million tons of the metal, which is about 70% of the proven reserves in the world. OPEC, at its height, had something like 45-50% of oil supply in the world, much less now. Yeah, less since the UAE as well. Yeah, exactly. And so the stranglehold, the concentration of these minerals in the country. They have one of the biggest lithium mines in the world. They have tantalum, which is a mineral which is used in the capacitors for batteries, which regulate power that comes out. Tungsten. They have gold. They have so many of these minerals that it seemed to me the epitome of what was happening. It epitomized every single point that I wanted to hit in this question. But of course, I went to Indonesia. I went to the Western Sahara. I was kicked out of the Moroccan part of the Western Sahara as well. And I was, went to southern Algeria as well, and looked at different places where other important metals came from. But I kept coming back to Congo, and then I couldn't come back to Congo at a certain point. And it just loomed so large in this entire story that it was impossible to do a book that was not so focused on Congo. And the other thing that I want to say is I go into the history not just of King Leopold, but also pre-colonial Congo as well, especially of the southern DRC, which is actually a very, very poorly understood outside of scholarly literature history. And it's really interesting because that part of Congo has been at the center of metals trade in Africa for 2,000 years almost, something like that, and maybe 1,500 years. And so I was really interested in how these ancient kings accrued power, formed alliances, and used some of the metals that we're fighting over today in order to form their ancient kingdoms. And I thought it was a kind of perfect metaphor for what was happening later in the book with China and the US squabbling.
And the Congo has always been also the object of wars. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of Congo, was murdered in Kolwezi, near Kolwezi, in that part of the Congo where the minerals are. The CIA was behind it. You've had more recently, as you said, Rwanda grabbing some of the minerals from the eastern DRC. John le Carré put one of his best post-Cold War novels in those wars, and foreigners wanted to grab the minerals in that part of the country. There's something about the imaginary of that place which is incredible.
Yeah, there is something about the imaginary. It was funny. I tried to step away a little bit from that imaginary of Congo, because there is something, of course, fascinating, and I've written about Congolese art, and I've written about Congolese music, and you meet incredible people there who are, despite the realities of living in one of the poorest countries in the world, doing incredible things with very, very little. Artists, musicians, people who are sort of self-taught academics and things like that. But what was really interesting to me was kind of how history sort of was repeating itself and these things. And I got a sort of a bit of a snippy review in the British press saying, somebody said, "You didn't capture the soul of Congo." And unfortunately I wasn't trying to do that. But it is an incredible country, and despite everything, it's a fascinating place. And I was so lucky to be able to travel that's really the truth of it. So
why were you arrested?
So it's a very, very complicated story. And nobody really knows why. There are different theories, but
these are the best.
but essentially, I had been looking into presidential ownership of mines. I was looking into a militia that was supposedly profiting from mining, and I was set up in this strange way by this weird character in southern DRC, in the town of Lubumbashi, and we were about to meet these people who supposedly were involved with the militia, for them to explain how they were profiting from the mine, and suddenly we were surrounded by soldiers. There was also a suggestion, which was made to me later in Washington, that certain demands had been made after I was taken, which sort of focused around a visit that was being made by the Secretary of State at the time. So there was some idea that I was being traded or leveraged or something like that. But very quickly I was released, so I was very lucky to only spend 6 days.
One of the aspects that's also interesting is the evolution of the technology, and the fact that a lot of research is being made on going beyond lithium-ion batteries. So in a way, the battles over minerals is not a permanent issue, because some of the technologies might use different minerals for different purposes. Where do you see these technologies going?
Yeah, so this is something that, I mean, every single time I, do a podcast or a talk or something like that, somebody goes, there's LFP batteries, and I talk about this actually in the book. People say, the book ignores LFP batteries. I said, well, they actually do come in, but quite far at the end, so obviously you haven't read the whole book. Look, LFP batteries have their own issues. Lithium itself has its own scarcity problems. But cobalt is so central to crude oil refining, to airplane engines, to military. I found out the other day that all the bunker busting bombs use cobalt to pierce into the ground. It's in vitamin B12, so it's so central to our life. And the fact is that it's not going to go away, and there's not going to be a drop in demand for cobalt anytime soon, especially since all these new batteries, they haven't figured out how to put them into phones in a cost-effective way. So that's one of the big things. How to put them into bikes and electric bikes in a cost-effective way as well. So yes, there's a lot of technological change. There's a lot of interesting new technologies. Everybody said, yes, your book was invalidated. The thesis of your book was invalidated because in Finland 2 weeks ago, they released this new thing called the donut battery, or a science lab announced that they had this new battery called the donut battery, which had very few critical metals in it. And I just said, look, that's great, but I don't see the donut battery being put into anything. I don't have a phone with a donut battery. I'm not driving a Tesla with a donut battery. Maybe that will be the case in 20 years' time, but 20 years is a long time. Even 10 years is a long time.
So you reckon that for the next, 10 years, the ingredients of today's rivalries, greedy extraction, and suffering will still remain?
I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, if you were to say to me in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected that he would be on stage during his second term with President Kagame and President Tshisekedi of Rwanda and Congo signing a peace deal, or whether he would even care enough to get into that level of African politics, I would have said that was next to impossible. The fact that they're putting so much resources show that they care and show that that politicians feel like they need these metals. So it's not just people saying it from the outside. It's actually on a real basis since the end of the last Trump administration, and since really when China sealed off its rare earth supply to Japan in 2014. So in 2014, China said, we're not going to give you rare earth for your industry, Japan, because we have this debate over the Senkaku Islands, which are these small islands between China and Japan, and nobody can agree who owns those islands. And that was the point at which people should have realized that there was a weakness, and the Japanese did realize that there was a weakness. But 5 years, 6 years later, Washington sort of woke up to it.
And the thing, to come back to the initial point, the thing that will not change, most likely, is the terrible environment and social conditions in which those minerals are extracted, because I don't see in the current international climate any will or possibility of regulating and imposing those regulations anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good projects. I mean, even some of the projects which were, done maybe for reasons of we want to do something to show that, like, we've done a bit of good work and then we can, run a mine on the other side. Even some of those projects worked pretty well. I mean, there was a pilot project at a mine called Mutoshi, in which they had no work-related deaths for the year and a half or so that it was open. I'm going to get that wrong, and somebody's going to fact-check me that it was only open for a year. a year or something like that. But for the period that it was open as a pilot project, and what they did was they gave proper safety equipment, proper training, and so on, and that was and women were more empowered in their work and so on. Right after that project closed, there was like, in the month after it closed, there were like 5 deaths. So it really showed the difference in approach.
Yeah.
However, that was seen to be uneconomic, which really surprised me, because I don't think that if people were told that they had to pay a little bit more for their cell phone, a little bit more for their Tesla, a little bit more for their laptop or whatever it is, and that would mean that people at the bottom of the supply chain would not be subject to these conditions, then I think people would be happy to pay. I think that there are ways to do this economically. There is hope, but at the moment, there just hasn't been enough of a push around that. It's really difficult to do because it requires working with local actors. It requires working with elements of the société civile in Congo, or local politicians in Indonesia, or solving issues in the Western Sahara, or whatever it is, or even going out and talking to mining communities in Idaho, because the last chapter is in a mine in the American West. The problem is that this sort of global and complicated picture is grasped by so few people, and the book was a kind of way of trying to like grab onto some of it, but it's in no way comprehensive because it's such a complex story.
The Congo sued Apple a couple of years ago in France and Belgium, actually, about the use of those minerals without being able to say where they come from and so on. And Apple has responded by saying we have traceability and we can say where it comes from, and nothing comes from exploitation or bad conditions. What do you make of that case and that debate?
Well, the case, I don't really. The last time I checked, it was just sort of dragging on, and
nothing happened.
Nothing's really happened, basically. But what's really interesting about it is that Apple kind of has these suspect producers that jump into and out of its supply chain, and one of those is Huayo Cobalt, which is a cobalt producer that I talk about a lot in the book, founded by this guy Chen Huihua, who's a guy who worked from being a seller of bean sprouts in the market in China to becoming the sort of head of this kind of very cobalt-based empire, basically. And at certain points, Apple has been criticized for having them in the supply chain. As early as 2016, actually, when Amnesty International and AfriWatch, which is a Congolese NGO, published a report called "This Is What We Die For." And that report led to scrutiny of Apple, and Apple said, okay, we're taking Huayo out of the supply chain. A couple of years later, it was back in the supply chain. And nothing on the ground had changed. And that was the time that I was going to Congo, and that was the time that I was seeing. I literally rode with a guy with his sacks of cobalt to go and sell it at a CDM thing. I said, look, did children mine? They said, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. So there's no traceability there. I saw it with my own eyes that company does not look into traceability because it is interested in profit and building its empire.
And it has no pressure to do so.
Yeah. So I think that Apple should also, even if today, right now, it's using recycled materials, it's using modern technologies that don't use so much cobalt, it should also have a bit of a look back. It should also have a look at where these recycled materials originally came from as well.
Because traceability is complicated, because you have those minerals that are coming from the regular multinational corporations who have some rules, and from these hundreds of or tens of thousands of workers who work in individually and sell to the Chinese, and everything then goes to China, and you cannot know where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways of tracing it, and many people have proposed blockchain ways of tracing it. However, that is only as good as the information that's put into it. I was speaking to some people involved with Sciences Po who were putting forth a digital product passport. They're trying to create a framework for that. Those initiatives are great, but it really requires having local actors who are properly compensated and properly paid for their work putting information back into the system. Now, whether that becomes a tax on the consumer or is it shared with the company, there's a question there. But that is one of the ways to ensure this kind of idea that, look, you're getting your batteries from a clean place.
So we should get maybe Hollywood stars, like for the blood diamonds, was a big campaign, which was pretty successful, I think, to try to impose traceability on something that was used in dirty world. Well, your turn. I'm sure you have many questions after this presentation. We have mics. Yes.
Yes. Thanks to you both for the discussion. I have to admit I haven't yet had a chance to read the book, so apologies if this is uninformed. You asked how to get people to care, and you mentioned also corruption. I mean, your book joins a very long history of books documenting corruption in extractive industries. I remember even in the New Yorker, I think Patrick Radden Keefe wrote about Guinea and others. There's just from minerals, but back 100 years to oil. So these stories, there's a through line, and they've been told many times. So how do we get people to care about this? Is one of the variables, and no offense to the two of you who've documented so much of this, who's telling the story? Is there a sort of Malala equivalent that we could support to tell stories like this? Because these very well-intentioned accounts that are thoroughly documented, the problem persists. And then quickly, I wondered if you looked into recent U.S. Sort of walking away from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and things like that. I mean, clearly the U.S. is interested on one level, but is that just harming this process even further? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think to answer the second part of your question first, the move away from the FCPA actually, I think, disadvantages the US in these countries. Oftentimes, people have talked about it as fighting with one hand behind their back or something like that. And I even had people like on the record being like, yeah, we were asked for these payments and then the State Department told us we couldn't pay, and like, wasn't that bad? And I was like, well, but the thing that you want to be doing is setting up businesses that are not paying. You want to be setting up businesses which are known for treating their workers correctly and have a deep base. And the Chinese companies, that's one of the disadvantages that they have, is that they are broadly perceived to be correctly or incorrectly, oftentimes correctly, as very corrupt in that part of the world. Secondly, is there a Congolese Malala? I don't know. I'm sure that would be great. Empowering Congolese journalists to do their work is really important. There are different norms around journalism in that part of the world. So one of the things that I think would be really powerful and good and interesting, if people want to gather together, is to set up some kind of unit or some kind of sort of training for people in doing journalism in that part of the world. And I recently launched a magazine, and we're trying to have voices of Congolese journalists as well as journalists from abroad. So there's a watch this space, I guess.
Thank you so much for going on this journey and opening up our eyes to this issue. And I wondered if you could share a human story of one of those folks at the bottom of the supply chain for us this evening, one that stands out to you.
The central character of the book, I guess I'll let you read the central character of the book, and his story is much more about frustration and not being able to to achieve his dreams. But there was a lady called Françoise Ilunga, her father was killed at a cave-in. They're called éboulements, on a mine that he had entered at night. He was mining minerals, he had entered very early in the morning. He was mining cobalt and copper there, and he was killed. And she had to keep on working to keep her children in school, because even though free education is supposedly guaranteed in Congo, the reality is that many of the teachers aren't paid, and you have to pay the teachers. Françoise, after her husband died, the only job that she could find was selling like little donuts, these beignets, beside a mine. So every day she had to go back to a place like the one her husband had died at. So I thought that was very, very powerful, and also showed just how central mining is to that economy.
Yes, my question is concerning an issue. A decade ago, we were working on the issue of Teke Figume. I think you know that. As a humanitarian NGO in the Republic Democratic of Congo. So actually the United States used to control the largest resource and mineral of cobalt and lithium, and we didn't understand. They decide to sell it to China. Today they are coming back, and actually they are opening a Cold War with China, with all the consequences that can have on Congolese people. So just my question is, why the America decide to sell it for the first place?
Yeah, there's a big question. So the Tenke Fungurume mine, which we talked about briefly, or TFM, is one of the world's largest copper and cobalt mines, if not the largest. And it's this huge mine that Mobutu Sese Seko, who was the dictator who controlled Congo after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba up until 1997, always held it back. He said, look, this is going to be the jewel in the crown of copper mining in southern Congo. This is going to be the way that the country really can prosper. And there was an economic strategy behind that. There's also a strategy of corruption because he enriched himself. This mine was sold at the time of the rebellion against Mobutu to a Swedish entrepreneur called Adolf Lundin. And Lundin was this kind of swashbuckling guy. Never did anything with the mine. He declared force majeure, and he left the mine to sit. And Joseph Kabila, who was the president of Congo in the early 2000s, went to do a peace conference in the United States, and he said, "Look, we have this mine. It's sitting there. It's doing nothing. London probably wants to sell it, but they want to sell it well, and they probably want to sell it to a Western company. Can you get the best company?" And George Bush, apparently, this is somebody who was in the room told me this, said that George Bush said, "Okay, send them to Phelps Dodge." So Phelps Dodge was this big mining company with a long history, and very quickly Kabila sent his people to go down to Phelps Dodge, and they basically started this mine with U.S. government funding. Fast forward a couple of years, the mine was bought by Freeport-McMoRan, which is a a big mining and oil exploration company out of Arizona. But Freeport-McMoRan has this really interesting history. It has two main things that supported it. One was oil, and one was copper. And copper comes from this big mine called the Grasberg in Indonesia. So there are three theories why Tenke Fungurume was sold. One, sorry, this might be a bit in the weeds for everybody, but one reason why Tenke Fungurume was sold was that they were trying to maintain their focus on the Grasberg mine in Indonesia. Two, they had a big hole in their budget because a lot of their oil wells had come up dry on a recent round of exploration in Louisiana. And three, the founder of the company, who is called Jim Bob Moffat, had died, and he had passed the company to a more kind of cautious leadership. And they were very concerned. Now, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the anti-corruption legislation of the US, you're allowed to make payments not to like bribe somebody to do something, but they're called facilitation payments. And facilitation payments are paying people to do a job that they would be doing already. So you're able to come in with these big crates, and this is actually not allowed by European countries, funnily enough. You're allowed to come in with these big crates of cash, and the lawyers were okay with the facilitation payments. I was speaking to the head of this operation quite a lot for this book. She was a wonderful source, and they said, look, this is wonderful. These facilitation payments can come in, but at a certain point, the board became very, very uncomfortable with that, and they thought that they might be running very close to the law at a certain point. So all these things came together in 2016. They decided to sell, and they sold their part. The other thing that's really interesting about this, and I've gone on for way too long on this question, but the Obama administration did not block the sale. And I spoke to the guy who was basically in charge of dealing with these questions in the Obama administration. He said, look, it's not the US government's job to block a sale. US companies don't, it's not like in France or in other parts of the world, don't work hand in glove with the US government. Oftentimes, US companies have different interests to the government. So nobody raised any objection from Washington during the sale. And he said, look, it wasn't our job to raise an objection. We didn't think it was geostrategic enough. Now, the big change that has happened in recent years, and this is really fascinating, is if you see in the last 2 months, there have been a string of US companies that have announced that they're doing work in DRC. And before, by the way, there was only a Coca-Cola bottling plant in the Kasai region. That was before last year, that was the only US business really operating in Congo. A string of US businesses that are basically focused on mining, on extraction of critical metals, and they are being fully supported by the State Department. And so now you see, and these companies were founded like 2 years ago by like some guy who was in the CIA and some guy who was in the Special Forces. So now you're seeing a lot more of this kind of state capitalistic type of drive in the US. And ironically, under Donald Trump, US industrial policy, I guess, has come much closer to China than previously. Anyway, sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
What do you mean closer to China?
Well, I think that it's more directed. It's more directed from above. I think that would be that's
the same model. Yeah.
One final question.
Yeah, I wondered if you could update us on the state of play of ocean mining and how it might actually affect all of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, so deep sea mining, for those who don't know, it's like using these tubes to suck, and I don't go into it in the book because there was a big craze for deep sea mining, and then it like kind of seems to have fallen off the map, and it's using these kind of these essentially these tubes with these suction devices at the end to suck out nodules from the deep sea. I don't understand it super well. They're very rich in metals like cobalt, rare earths, all that kind of thing. I had an interview with a mining executive who, at one point, I said, "Look, what about deep sea mining? Like, isn't that going to be an important part of your business?" He goes, "We haven't figured out how to fully finance a mine on the ground. We don't know how to properly operate mines, and we don't know how to regulate that." So, what tells you? He has a thick South African accent, so you can imagine how the delivery came across. What tells you that we're going to be able to do deep sea fucking mining? And I said, look, it could happen. Anyway, then I spoke with other people who are very bullish on it. I think it's a bit of a, again, we know where the minerals are in Congo. They're pretty close to the surface. Like, we could do all this stuff in an ethical way that's not polluting, that respects people's human rights, and yet we're not doing it. Instead, we're just fighting over it. And the reason that that's happening, that deep sea mining is happening, is more of a symptom than a solution, I find.
What about space?
I mean, even better. We can send Elon up there.
Last question here.
Hello. Well, thank you so much. And I've actually read the book. I listened to the audiobook that I highly recommend because it's narrated by Nick, and it's wonderful. And it's 16 hours. So I have a question. It's a bit complicated, but I'm trying, because it's about, is this a utopia actually to try to regulate? Because we see that, and in the book you say, it's since the beginning, it's being a sort of story that at the end corruption wins. There's a lot of cruelty, and this is about humanity actually at the end of the day. But then, like, of course, there's the Chinese way of doing it and the American, basically. And Elon Musk is a very important figure nowadays because of lithium. And Elon Musk also plays, as you say in the book, that he just put some webcams, but they never even checked what was going on. And there's a lot of hypocrisy, and the difference between Chinese and the American is actually the straightforward of the Chinese, which is business, and the Americans, they manage a lot of hypocrisy. And I was thinking about, you probably seen the movie The Killings of the Flower Moon. That is also a book. Which is about where they discovered this oil coming out from the Osage, and that's how the FBI actually was born. And I wonder, like, is it a utopia that there could be a regulation where there's a way of having a police or something that it's not corrupted? Because now you say the CIA is very much involved in all these deals. And I think there could be a way if it's focused.
Well, I think there could be many different ways to make things better, but I agree that an overarching system is quite utopian. I think that things need to start at the grassroots, at the ground level. I think that working with people on the ground. At the end of the book, there's the example of the king of Bunkea, who has managed to get the redevance, the royalties of mining back to his people, and he's been able to build schools, a university. He's been able to build even a site touristique, all these things, and it's this, and it's a kind of model community. So I think that things on a small scale, on a local scale, actually, funny enough, do accumulate, and you can create change by doing these sort of local things. However, the problem is that now that there are so many powerful and self-interested actors, this dichotomy between the US and the Chinese system, as you were asking the question, actually, I was thinking, in a way, the US system is the Chinese system at the moment. The US might be trying to change that, but the US has used China during the globalization years, and China has used the US, and it's a kind of symbiosis that is now being disrupted by these power games. But actually, we're really all part of that same system.
Can
Thank
we
you.
have a big round of applause for Nicolas and Pierre?